The gunshot that saved Florence Ramsey's life echoed across the canyon, just as the lead wolf's teeth were inches from her throat. She had been running through the New Mexico wilderness for what felt like hours, her expensive traveling dress torn to ribbons, her carefully pinned hair now a wild tangle down her back. The stagecoach robbery that morning had left her stranded 15 miles outside Santa Fe, and the driver dead on the trail. She had run, thinking civilization couldn't be far, but the wolves had picked up her scent as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Now, as the gunshot rang out and the wolf fell dead at her feet, Florence collapsed onto the rocky ground, gasping for air, her lungs burning. "Stay down." A man's voice called out, deep and commanding. 3 more shots cracked through the air in rapid succession. Florence pressed her face against the cold earth, smelling sage and dust, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She heard snarling, the yelping of wounded animals, and then the thunder of hooves approaching. When she finally dared to lift her head, she saw him. He sat astride a paint horse, a Winchester rifle still raised to his shoulder, his eyes scanning the tree line where the remaining wolves had retreated. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty brown hat pulled low over his face. As he lowered the rifle and turned his attention to her, Florence caught her first clear look at him. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with a strong jaw darkened by several days' growth of beard, and eyes the color of creek water in summer, a striking gray-green that seemed to see right through her. "Can you stand?" he asked, dismounting in one fluid motion. Florence tried to push herself up, but her legs were shaking so badly she could barely manage to get to her knees. Without a word, the cowboy stepped forward and offered his hand. She took it, noticing the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip as he pulled her to her feet. She wobbled, and his other hand came up to steady her by the elbow. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse from screaming and running. "They killed the stagecoach driver. Robbers stopped us this morning and I ran, and then the wolves." "Easy now," he said, his voice gentler than before. "You are safe. Name's Yates Xavier. I have a ranch about 2 miles east of here." "Florence Ramsey," she replied, then looked down at herself. Her green traveling dress, which had cost a small fortune in Boston, was now barely more than rags. There was blood on the hem, though she couldn't tell if it was hers or from the wolf that had come so close. "I must look a fright." Yates Xavier's mouth quirked slightly, not quite a smile. "You look alive, Miss Ramsey. That's what matters out here." He walked back to his horse and returned with a canteen, which he offered to her. Florence drank gratefully, the water cool and clean, washing away the dust that had coated her throat. As she drank, she studied him more carefully. He wore simple clothes, a work shirt and denim pants, both well worn but clean. His boots were scuffed leather and a gun belt sat low on his hips. Everything about him spoke of a man who lived by practical means, who had no use for ornament or pretense. "Can you ride?" he asked, taking the canteen back. "I can ride," Florence said, though in truth she had only ever ridden side saddle in Central Park under the watchful eye of an instructor. This seemed like the wrong moment to mention that detail. Yates swung back up onto his horse and extended his arm down to her. "Step on my boot and take my hand. I will pull you up behind me." Florence hesitated only a moment before following his instructions. His strength surprised her as he lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. She settled behind the saddle, acutely aware that she would need to hold onto him to stay mounted. Gingerly, she placed her hands on his waist. "You will want to hold tighter than that," Yates said, and without further warning he urged his horse into a canter. Florence gasped and wrapped her arms around his middle, pressing against his back. She could feel the solid warmth of him through his shirt, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. As they rode across the rugged terrain, she closed her eyes and tried not to think about how improper this was. How shocked her mother would be if she could see her daughter now, clinging to a strange man in the New Mexico wilderness. But her mother was dead now. That was why Florence had been on that stagecoach in the first place. The ride took longer than 2 miles should have taken, but Yates explained as they rode that he was taking a circuitous route to avoid the roughest terrain and to stay clear of any areas where the wolf pack might regroup. By the time they reached his ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Florence had never seen in Boston. The colors were so vivid they almost didn't seem real. The ranch itself was modest, a single-story house built of adobe and timber, with a barn, a corral, and several outbuildings. Florence could see cattle grazing in the distance, and a few horses in the corral lifted their heads to watch as Yates rode up to the house. He dismounted first, then helped her down. Florence's legs nearly gave out when her feet touched the ground, stiff and sore from the harrowing day. Again, Yates steadied her, his hands firm on her arms. "You should sit down," he said, guiding her toward the house. "I need to tend to my horse, but then I will see about getting you cleaned up and fed." Florence wanted to protest that she could manage herself, but the truth was she felt utterly exhausted and overwhelmed. She nodded and allowed him to lead her inside. The interior of the house was as simple as the exterior, but clean and well kept. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, and a few pieces of simple furniture. She could see a doorway leading to what must be a bedroom and another to what looked like a small kitchen area. "Sit," Yates said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I will be back shortly." He left her there, and Florence sank into the chair, feeling the full weight of the day settle over her. She looked down at her ruined dress, at her scraped and bleeding hands, and suddenly tears began to stream down her face. She tried to stop them, had always prided herself on her composure, but the fear and shock and exhaustion overwhelmed her defenses. She wept quietly, her shoulders shaking until she heard the door open again. Yates stood in the doorway, his hat now removed, revealing thick, dark brown hair. He looked at her crying, and something shifted in his expression, a softening that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "I am sorry," Florence said, wiping at her eyes. "I do not usually cry like this." "You have had a hard day," Yates said simply. He moved to the kitchen area and began pumping water into a basin. "I imagine most folks would cry after being chased by wolves." He brought the basin to the table along with some clean cloths. "You can wash up here. I do not have much in the way of women's clothing, but I can find you something clean to wear while I see about mending your dress, or what's left of it." Florence looked at the water, then at him. "You sew." "A man who lives alone learns to do a lot of things," Yates said. "I am not saying it will look pretty, but I can make it functional." She managed a small smile. "That would be very kind of you." Yates nodded and retreated to the bedroom, returning a moment later with a clean cotton shirt and a pair of pants. "These will be too big, but they are clean. You can change in the bedroom. I will get started on supper." Florence took the clothes and went into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. The room was as spare as the rest of the house, containing only a bed with a simple quilt, a dresser, and a washstand. She peeled off her ruined dress, wincing as she saw the bruises already forming on her legs and arms. Using the water and cloths Yates had provided, she washed away the dirt and blood as best she could, then put on the clothes he had given her. As predicted, they were far too large. She had to roll up the sleeves of the shirt several times, and the pants threatened to fall off until she found a piece of rope in the dresser drawer and used it as a makeshift belt. She must look ridiculous, but at least she was clean and covered. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Yates at the stove, cooking something that smelled wonderful. He glanced at her, and that almost smile appeared again. "Better?" he asked. "Much better, thank you." Florence moved closer, drawn by the delicious aroma. "What are you making?" "Just beans and salt pork," he said. "Nothing fancy. There is some bread, too, if it has not gone too stale." "It smells like heaven," Florence said honestly. She realized she hadn't eaten since early that morning before the robbery. They sat down to eat a short while later, and Florence found that, simple as the meal was, it was one of the best she had ever tasted. Or perhaps she was just that hungry. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Yates spoke. "You said you were on a stagecoach. Where were you headed?" "Santa Fe," Florence replied. "I was coming from Boston. My mother passed away 3 months ago, and I inherited some property here in New Mexico. I came to see it, to decide what to do with it." "I am sorry for your loss," Yates said quietly. "Thank you." "We were not close, but she was still my mother." Florence paused, then asked, "What about you? Have you lived here long?" "5 years," Yates said. "Bought this land with money I saved up working on other ranches. It is not much, but it is mine." Florence heard the pride in his voice and understood it. "It is a good piece of land," she said, though in truth she knew nothing about judging land. But she could see it mattered to him. "The property you inherited," Yates said. "Where is it?" "I am not entirely sure," Florence admitted. "I have the deed and documents in my traveling bag, which is probably still on that stagecoach, if the robbers did not take it. We can ride out tomorrow and look for it," Yates offered. "It is not safe for you to try to make it to Santa Fe on your own, not with robbers and wolves about. You can stay here tonight, and tomorrow we will see about getting you to town or finding your property." Florence felt a rush of gratitude. "You have already done so much. I do not want to impose further." "It is no imposition," Yates said, and she believed him. There was something straightforward about this man, something honest that she found refreshing after years of navigating Boston society with its endless rules and hidden meanings. After supper, Yates insisted she take the bed while he would sleep on a bedroll in the main room. Florence protested, but he was immovable on the point. As she lay down on the surprisingly comfortable bed, she could hear him moving about in the other room, and she felt safer than she had since leaving Boston. This strange cowboy who had saved her life had also given her shelter and food without asking for anything in return, without even questioning her story. In Boston, such generosity would have come with expectations, with strings attached. Here, it seemed to be just the way things were done. She fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the day's events, and did not wake until morning light streamed through the small window. When Florence emerged from the bedroom, she found Yates already up, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove. He had shaved, she noticed, and looked younger without the heavy stubble. He was handsome, she realized with a small start, in a rugged, weathered way that was entirely different from the refined gentleman she had known back east. "Morning," he said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Florence admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Thank you again for your hospitality." "We should head out soon," Yates said. "The sooner we find that stagecoach, the better chance we have of recovering your belongings, assuming the robbers left anything behind." They set out within the hour, Florence once again riding behind Yates on his horse. In the morning light, she could better appreciate the landscape around them. The terrain was rugged and beautiful in a way that was entirely foreign to her, all red rocks and scattered piñon pines, with mountains rising in the distance. The sky seemed impossibly vast, stretching endlessly above them. As they rode, Yates pointed out various landmarks, explaining the land to her. He showed her where to find water, how to read the signs of animal tracks, which plants were safe and which were poisonous. Florence listened intently, fascinated by this world so different from her own. "You seem to know this land well," she observed. "A man has to if he wants to survive out here," Yates replied. "The land does not forgive mistakes." They found the stagecoach around mid-morning, exactly where Florence had left it. The driver's body was still there, and Yates took the time to bury him properly, fashioning a crude cross from broken wood. Florence said a prayer over the grave, feeling the weight of the man's death even though she had not known him. Her traveling bag was indeed still in the coach, though it had been rifled through. Her clothes were scattered, but the important documents were still there, tucked into a hidden pocket the robbers had apparently missed. Yates helped her gather everything, and she was grateful to have her own dress to change into, even if it was wrinkled from being stuffed in the bag. "Look at this," Florence said, pulling out the deed and examining it more carefully. "The property is apparently called the Riverside Ranch. It is south of Santa Fe, near the river." Yates leaned over to look at the document, and Florence caught the scent of him, soap and leather and something else, something earthy and masculine that made her heart beat a little faster. She pushed the feeling aside, reminding herself that she was a proper Boston lady, even if she was currently standing in the New Mexico wilderness, wearing a wrinkled traveling dress and a dead man's coat that Yates had draped over her shoulders for warmth. "I know that property," Yates said, and there was something odd in his voice. "It borders my land to the south." Florence looked up at him in surprise. "It does? That is quite a coincidence." "There are not that many ranches in this area," Yates said. "The Riverside Ranch has been abandoned for about 3 years now, since old Jeremiah Ramsey died." "Ramsey," Florence repeated. "He must have been some relation of my mother's. She never spoke much about her family out here." "He was a good man," Yates said. "Helped me when I first came to the territory, taught me a lot about ranching. I was sorry when he passed." "Then we are neighbors," Florence said, trying out the word. It felt strange on her tongue. "Seems so," Yates agreed. "Though from what I have seen riding past, the place needs a lot of work. The house is still standing, but the barn needs repairs, and the land has gone wild without anyone tending it." Florence looked down at the deed in her hands. She had come west planning to sell the property and return to Boston. She had a small inheritance from her mother, enough to live modestly but not extravagantly, and selling the New Mexico land would have given her more financial security. But now, standing here in this vast landscape with this quiet cowboy beside her, she felt something stirring inside her, something she could not quite name. "Would you show it to me?" she asked. "The property," Yates nodded. "It is not far. We can ride there now if you like." They gathered the rest of Florence's belongings and secured them on Yates's horse, then set off south. The ride took about an hour, and when they crested a low rise, Yates pointed down into a valley. "That is the Riverside Ranch," he said. Florence looked down and felt her breath catch. The house was indeed still standing, a 2-story structure of adobe and wood with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. The barn was in need of repair, as Yates had said, but the bones of it were good. And running through the property, sparkling in the sunlight, was a clear river lined with cottonwood trees. Beyond the house and barn, she could see rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "It is good land," Yates said. "Water rights to the river, good grazing, protected from the worst of the winter winds by those hills to the north." Jeremiah knew what he was doing when he claimed it. They rode down to the house, and Florence dismounted before Yates could help her, eager to explore. The front door was unlocked, and she pushed it open carefully, half expecting it to fall off its hinges. But it swung smoothly, revealing a dusty interior that had clearly once been someone's beloved home. The main room was large, with a stone fireplace similar to Yates's. There was furniture covered in dust sheets, and when Florence pulled one back, she found a beautiful hand-carved rocking chair. The kitchen had a large table and a good stove, and when she tested the pump, water still flowed, though it sputtered at first. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, each with windows that looked out over the property. Standing in the largest bedroom, Florence could see for miles, all the way to the mountains in the distance. She could also see Yates's ranch to the north, a small cluster of buildings that looked miniature from this distance. Yates had followed her upstairs, and now he stood in the doorway, watching her with those gray-green eyes. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. Florence turned to face him. "I am thinking that I came here planning to sell this place and go back to Boston, but now I am not so sure. What is in Boston for you?" It was a simple question, but it struck deep. Florence thought about her life back east, the narrow streets and narrower expectations, the suffocating rules of society, the endless rounds of meaningless social calls and vapid conversations. She thought about the future that awaited her there, probably as some aging bachelor's wife, managing a household and hosting dinner parties until she died. "Not much," she admitted. "I have some friends but no close family. My mother's friends tolerated me but never truly accepted me. I was always too outspoken, too interested in things ladies were not supposed to care about." "What things?" Yates asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Books mostly. Ideas. I wanted to go to university, but of course that was impossible. I wanted to travel to see the world beyond Boston, but unmarried ladies do not do such things." She laughed bitterly. "And yet here I am, about as far from Boston as I could get." Yates moved into the room, standing beside her at the window. "Out here a woman can own land, run a ranch, make her own way. It is not easy, but it is possible. I have seen it done." "Is that what you think I should do?" Florence asked, turning to look at him. "Stay here and try to run this ranch?" "I think you should do whatever will make you happy," Yates said. "But I will tell you this. In the short time I have known you, I have seen you face down wolves, survive a robbery, and keep going when most people would have fallen apart. You are stronger than you think, Florence Ramsey." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice made something flutter in her chest. She realized she was standing very close to him, close enough to see the flecks of darker green in his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I do not know the first thing about running a ranch," she said softly. "I could teach you," Yates offered, then seemed to catch himself. "Or you could hire people who know. There are plenty of experienced ranch hands looking for work." "Would you really teach me?" Florence asked. "Even though I would be your competitor for grazing land and water?" "There is plenty of land and water for both of us," Yates said, "and I owed Jeremiah a debt of gratitude. Helping his kin would be a way to repay that." "Is that the only reason?" The question escaped before Florence could stop it, too bold, too revealing. Yates held her gaze for a long moment. "No," he said finally, "it is not the only reason." The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken things. Florence knew she should step back, should maintain proper distance, but she found she did not want to. This man had saved her life, had shown her kindness without expecting anything in return, and was now looking at her like she was something precious and rare. "I should get you to Santa Fe," Yates said, though he made no move to leave. "You will need supplies if you are going to stay here, and you should report the robbery to the sheriff." "Yes," Florence agreed, though the last thing she wanted was to leave this moment. That would be practical. They stood there for another heartbeat, neither moving, and then Yates turned away, breaking the spell. "We should head out. It is a few hours' ride to Santa Fe." The ride to town was quieter than their previous journeys. Florence held onto Yates's waist, her cheek pressed against his back, and let her mind wander. She was seriously considering staying, she realized. Staying in this wild, beautiful place and trying to make a life for herself. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Santa Fe itself was larger than she expected, a bustling town with adobe buildings lining dusty streets. Yates led them first to the sheriff's office, where Florence gave her account of the robbery. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Decker, listened carefully and promised to investigate, though he did not sound hopeful about recovering anything or catching the culprits. "Robberies are common on that stretch of road," he told her. "We do our best, but it is a lot of territory to cover." From the sheriff's office, Yates took her to a general store where she was able to purchase some practical clothing more suited to ranch life. The storekeeper's wife, a kind woman named Mrs. Chen, helped her select sturdy dresses, boots, and supplies. When Florence mentioned she was planning to reopen the Riverside Ranch, Mrs. Chen's eyes lit up. "Oh, that is wonderful news. We loved old Jeremiah. He was one of the good ones, always fair in his dealings, always willing to help a neighbor." She leaned in conspiratorially. "And it will be nice for Mr. Xavier to have a neighbor again. That man spends too much time alone." Florence glanced at Yates, who was studiously examining some rope on the other side of the store, but she could see the tips of his ears turning red. They spent the rest of the day purchasing supplies. Yates knew exactly what she would need to get started, from tools to food stores to livestock feed. He introduced her to various merchants and helped her arrange for larger items to be delivered to the ranch. Through it all, Florence watched how people interacted with him. They respected him, she realized. They greeted him warmly, asked after his health and his cattle, and treated him like a valued member of the community. By the time they were ready to leave town, the sun was beginning to set. They had so many supplies that Yates had purchased a pack horse to carry everything. "I will pay you back," Florence insisted as they loaded the last of the purchases. "For the horse and for your time." "The horse is a loan," Yates said, "and my time is freely given. But if you want to repay me, you can invite me for supper once you get your kitchen in order." Florence smiled. "That seems a fair trade." They made camp that night under the stars, not wanting to push the horses too hard with the heavy loads. Yates built a fire and made coffee and beans, and they sat together in companionable silence, watching the flames dance. "Can I ask you something?" Florence said after a while. "Sure." "Why do you live alone? Mrs. Chen seemed to think you are too solitary." Yates was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I was married once," he said finally. "Back in Texas. Her name was Sarah. We were young, thought we had our whole lives ahead of us." "What happened?" Florence asked gently. "Fever took her. We had been married just over a year." His voice was flat, controlled. "After she died, I could not stay there. Everything reminded me of her, so I came out here, started over." "I am so sorry," Florence said, understanding now the sadness she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. "It was 5 years ago," Yates said. "The grief is not as sharp as it was, but I have gotten used to being alone. It is easier in some ways." "Is it?" Florence asked. "Easier?" Yates looked at her across the fire, and the firelight played across his features, turning his eyes golden. "It was," he said, "until recently." Florence's heart began to beat faster. "What changed?" "I met a woman who was brave enough to face down wolves," Yates said softly. "Who looks at this hard land and sees possibility instead of hardship. Who makes me think that maybe being alone is not the same as being at peace." Florence stood and walked around the fire to sit beside him. It was bold, perhaps too bold, but she was tired of being cautious. "Yates," she said, and he turned to face her fully. "I have not known you long, but I feel like I can trust you more than people I have known my entire life." "Is that foolish?" "I do not think so," Yates said. He reached out and took her hand, his rough palm warm against hers. "I feel the same way." They sat like that, hands clasped, until the fire burned down to embers. Then Yates prepared 2 bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining propriety even though Florence wished he would not. She lay awake for a long time, staring up at the stars, more numerous than she had ever imagined possible, and thought about the turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been in Boston preparing for a tedious journey. Now she was lying under the New Mexico sky, her hand still tingling from Yates's touch, planning to become a rancher. The next morning they reached the Riverside Ranch just after noon. Yates helped her unload all the supplies, carrying them into the house while Florence began the work of cleaning. It was hard physical labor, sweeping away months of dust and debris, but she found it satisfying in a way that her carefully orchestrated Boston life had never been. "I should head back to my place," Yates said as the afternoon wore on. "My cattle will need tending, but I will come by tomorrow if you like, help you start fixing up the barn." "I would like that very much," Florence said. "And Yates, thank you for everything." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face, and Florence felt her stomach flip. "See you tomorrow, Florence." After he left, Florence stood on her porch and watched him ride away across the prairie until he disappeared from sight. Then she went back inside and continued cleaning, her mind already spinning with plans for the future. The next morning, she woke early and made coffee using the supplies Yates had helped her buy. She had just finished dressing in one of her new practical dresses when she heard hoofbeats outside. Looking out the window, she saw Yates riding up with another man beside him. She went out to meet them, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Morning," Yates greeted her. "This is Miguel Torres. He is a good carpenter, and I thought you could use his help with the barn." Miguel was a man in his 40s with a weather-beaten face and kind eyes. He swept his hat off as he dismounted. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Ramsey. Mr. Xavier tells me you are reopening the ranch." "That is the plan," Florence said, offering her hand to shake. Miguel looked surprised but shook it warmly. "My boys and I can help with the repairs," Miguel said. "We have been looking for work since the Double R Ranch closed down last month." "How many boys?" Florence asked. "3, all grown. Good workers, honest." Florence made a quick decision. "If they are half as good as Mr. Xavier says you are, I would be happy to hire all of you. I cannot pay much at first, but room and board would be included, and wages would improve as the ranch becomes profitable." Miguel's face broke into a wide smile. "That is more than fair, Miss Ramsey." "Thank you." They spent the rest of the morning discussing what needed to be done. The list was long, but Miguel assured her it was all manageable with enough time and labor. His sons arrived around midday, 3 strapping young men named Carlos, Diego, and Rafael, and immediately set to work on the barn under their father's direction. Yates worked alongside them, and Florence found herself watching him more than she should. He had removed his shirt in the heat of the day, and she could see the play of muscles across his back as he hauled timber. She forced herself to look away, focusing instead on her own tasks. Over the next few weeks, the ranch slowly came to life. The barn was repaired and reinforced. The fences were mended. Florence hired 2 more hands, older men named Jack and Silas who knew cattle and horses. She bought a small herd of cattle at auction in Santa Fe, using a portion of her inheritance, and Yates helped her negotiate a fair price. Every day, Yates found a reason to come by. Sometimes he brought supplies, sometimes just advice, But Florence began to realize that the ranch work was not his only motivation. She caught him watching her sometimes, when he thought she was not looking, with an expression that made her breath catch. For her part, Florence was falling. She tried to deny it at first, told herself she was just grateful for his help, but she knew it was more than that. She loved the way he explained things to her with patience, never making her feel stupid for asking questions. She loved his quiet competence, the way he could fix almost anything with his hands. She loved the rare smiles he gave her, like gifts to be treasured. One evening, about a month after she had moved to the ranch, Yates stayed for supper as had become his habit. The Torres family had their own quarters in the repaired barn, and the other hands bunked in one of the outbuildings, so Florence and Yates were alone in the main house. She had been practicing her cooking, determined to master the practical skills she would need, and tonight's stew had actually turned out well. They ate together at the kitchen table, talking about the day's work, and Florence felt a contentment she had never known before. "The ranch is looking good," Yates said. "You have done well, Florence." "I have had a lot of help," she replied. "I could not have done any of this without you." "You could have," Yates said. "You are more capable than you give yourself credit for." Florence set down her spoon and looked at him directly. "Yates, can I ask you something, always? Why do you really come by here every day? We both know you have your own ranch to run." Yates was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching her face. Then he stood and walked around the table, offering his hand. "Come with me." Florence took his hand and let him lead her outside onto the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in those vivid colors she had come to love. They stood together, watching the light change, and Yates still held her hand. "I come here," he said quietly, "because when I am with you, I feel alive in a way I have not felt in years. I come here because I wake up in the morning thinking about seeing you, and I go to sleep at night remembering your smile. I come here because I am falling in love with you, Florence, and I cannot seem to stay away." Florence turned to face him, her heart pounding. "Yates." "I know it is too soon," he continued. "I know you came here to start a new life on your own terms, and I do not want to complicate that. But I cannot keep pretending that neighborly help is all I am offering. If you want me to stop coming around so often, just say so, and I will respect that." "Stop," Florence said, and she saw pain flash across his face. "No, I mean stop talking." She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his evening stubble against her palms. "I am falling in love with you too. I have been trying not to, telling myself I need to focus on the ranch, on building my own life, but the truth is that I want you to be part of that life." Yates's hands came up to cover hers. "Are you sure? I am not a fancy Boston gentleman. I am just a cowboy with a small ranch and no prospects for grandeur." "I do not want grandeur," Florence said. "I want you. I want this life, this beautiful, hard, real life, and I want to share it with you." Yates pulled her close and kissed her then, and it was like coming home. His lips were warm and gentle, asking rather than demanding, and Florence answered by pressing closer, her arms winding around his neck. The kiss deepened, and she felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the first time I saw you, covered in dust and fighting off wolves." Florence laughed breathlessly. "I must have looked terrible." "You looked magnificent," Yates said. "Fierce and alive and absolutely beautiful." They stayed on the porch for hours, talking and kissing and making plans for a future together. Yates proposed properly that night, getting down on one knee right there on the porch, and Florence said yes through happy tears. They were married 6 weeks later in Santa Fe, in a small ceremony attended by the ranch hands, the Torres family, and several of the friends they had made in town. Florence wore a simple white dress she had purchased at Mrs. Chen's store, and Yates wore a new suit that made him look unbearably handsome. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed her in front of everyone with such tenderness that several people in the small crowd wiped their eyes. The reception was held at the Riverside Ranch, which they had both agreed would become their primary home since it was larger and better suited for a family. They would keep Yates's original ranch for the cattle and as a bunkhouse for additional hands. As the sun set on their wedding day, Yates and Florence stood together on their porch, watching their friends and neighbors celebrate below. Yates had his arm around her waist, and Florence leaned into him, feeling perfectly content. "Happy?" Yates asked softly. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Florence replied. "A few months ago I was miserable in Boston, feeling like my life was over before it had really begun. And now look at me. I am a rancher, a wife, and I have more adventures ahead than behind." "We have more adventures ahead," Yates corrected gently. "We are partners now in everything." Florence turned in his arms and kissed him. "Partners," she agreed. "I love the sound of that." That night, after their guests had gone home and the ranch was quiet, Yates carried Florence over the threshold of their bedroom. They made love slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies, whispering promises and endearments. Florence had been nervous, her limited knowledge of marital relations coming from vague hints and euphemisms. But Yates was patient and gentle, making sure her pleasure matched his own. Afterward, lying in his arms, Florence felt like she had finally found where she belonged. Not in Boston with its suffocating society, but here in this wild land with this good man beside her. The first year of their marriage was not easy, but it was rich with joy and growth. They worked side by side building up both ranches, and Florence proved to have a natural head for business. She negotiated better prices for their cattle, found new markets in Santa Fe and even as far away as Albuquerque, and managed their finances with skill that surprised even her. Yates, for his part, was a patient teacher and a loving husband. He showed Florence everything he knew about ranching, from reading the weather to doctoring sick cattle to managing the hands. He also encouraged her ideas, never dismissing them as foolish even when they were unconventional. It was Florence's idea to start breeding horses along with cattle, recognizing a growing market for quality mounts. It was also her idea to dig an irrigation system from the river, allowing them to grow hay and vegetables. Both ventures proved profitable, and their combined ranches began to prosper. But the greatest joy came at the end of their first year of marriage, when Florence discovered she was pregnant. She told Yates on a crisp autumn evening as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. "I have some news," she said, trying to contain her excitement. Yates turned to her, immediately attentive. "What is it?" "We are going to have a baby," Florence said, and watched as the information registered on his face. His expression went from surprise to joy to something like awe. "A baby," he repeated, then pulled her into his arms. "Florence, that is wonderful. Are you feeling well? Should you be sitting out here in the cold?" She laughed at his sudden concern. "I am perfectly fine, but you might need to take on more of the heavy work around here for the next several months." "Of course," Yates said immediately. "Whatever you need. Anything." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Florence found the physical limitations frustrating. She was used to being active, riding out to check on the cattle, working in the barn, and being forced to take things easier chafed at her independent nature. But Yates was wonderfully supportive, taking over her usual tasks without complaint and making sure she rested. Their son was born on a bright May morning, with Mrs. Torres serving as midwife. It was a long labor, and there were moments when Florence thought she could not bear another minute. But then Yates was there, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, telling her how strong she was, how proud he was of her. When she finally heard that first cry, Florence wept with relief and joy. Mrs. Torres placed the baby in her arms, and Florence looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature and fell in love all over again. "He is perfect," Yates said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand, and the infant's fingers curled around his father's thumb. What should we call him? They had discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at her son, Florence knew exactly what felt right. "Jeremiah," she said, "after the man who gave us this land and brought us together." Yates smiled, tears in his eyes. "Jeremiah Xavier, I like that." The baby changed everything and nothing. The ranch work continued, but now their days were punctuated by feedings and diaper changes, and the sweet sounds of a baby discovering the world. Florence had worried she would not know how to be a mother, having had such a distant relationship with her own, but she found that love made up for inexperience. Yates was a wonderful father, patient and gentle with their son. Florence often found him in the nursery at night, just watching Jeremiah sleep, a look of wonder on his face. When she asked him about it, he said, "I never thought I would have this again. A family. I thought that part of my life was over when Sarah died, but you gave it back to me, Florence. You gave me everything." As Jeremiah grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to thrive. They hired more hands, expanded their herds, and became known throughout the territory for their quality livestock and fair dealings. Florence became involved in the community, helping to establish a school in Santa Fe and advocating for better roads and services in the area. When Jeremiah was 3, Florence became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and though the pregnancy was harder than the first, she bore it with grace. Their daughter was born in the winter, during a rare snowfall that blanketed the ranch in white. "Another perfect child," Yates marveled, holding his daughter for the first time. "What shall we name this one, Sarah?" Florence said softly. "If that is all right with you, I know she was important to you and I want to honor that." Yates looked at her with such love and gratitude that Florence felt her heart might burst. "That means more to me than you know," he said. "But are you sure?" "I am sure," Florence said. "Sarah was part of your life, part of what made you who you are, and I am grateful for that because who you are is the man I love." Baby Sarah was calmer than her brother had been, a peaceful baby who seemed content to observe the world with wide gray-green eyes like her father's. Jeremiah was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help care for her, and Florence's heart swelled watching her little family. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and ranch work and family life. Jeremiah grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the ranch and spent hours following his father around, learning everything he could. Sarah was more adventurous, always exploring, always asking questions, keeping both parents on their toes. When the children were old enough, Florence began teaching them to read and write, using the books she had brought from Boston and others she ordered from back east. Yates taught them about the land, about cattle and horses, about reading the sky and the seasons. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Yates took Florence on a ride up into the hills above the ranch, to a spot that overlooked both their original properties. They dismounted and stood together, looking down at the life they had built. "Do you ever regret it?" Yates asked. "Giving up your Boston life for this?" Florence looked at him in surprise. "Not for a single moment. Do you regret finding you?" "Never. But sometimes I wonder if you miss the refinement, the culture, the things I cannot give you out here." Florence took his hands in hers. "Yates Xavier, you gave me a life worth living. You gave me purpose and passion and a family I love more than anything in this world. Boston gave me nothing but restrictions and expectations I could never meet. You gave me freedom to be myself, to build something with my own hands, to love without restraint. How could I ever regret that? Yates pulled her close and kissed her, and it was like the first time all over again, full of promise and passion. I love you, Florence Xavier, more today than the day I married you, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me, Florence said, resting her head on his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the sun paint gold across their land. In the distance, they could see the ranch house where their children were probably getting into some kind of mischief. They could see the barns and corrals, the grazing cattle, the river glinting in the light. They had built this together, from nearly nothing, and it was good. As they rode back down the hill, Florence thought about the girl she had been when she arrived in New Mexico, scared and lost and running from wolves. Yates had saved her that day, but in truth, they had saved each other. He had been living a half-life, going through the motions, never really allowing himself to feel or hope or dream again. She had shown him that love did not die just because it had been hurt before, that hearts could heal and grow and love again. And she, who had been slowly suffocating under the weight of expectations and propriety, had found a place where she could breathe, where she could be fully herself. She had found purpose in building the ranch, joy in her family, and a love deeper than she had ever imagined possible. Time continued its steady march. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Florence and Yates grew older together with grace and gratitude. Jeremiah eventually took over most of the day-to-day running of the ranch, proving to be a natural leader with his father's steady temperament and his mother's head for business. Sarah married a young doctor who came to practice in Santa Fe, giving Florence and Yates 4 grandchildren to spoil. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the Riverside Ranch for a celebration. The house was full of noise and laughter, children running through the rooms that Florence and Yates had restored with their own hands all those years ago. As the party wound down and the younger grandchildren were put to bed, Florence and Yates slipped away to their favorite spot on the porch. The evening was warm and the stars were out in their full glory. 30 years, Florence mused. Where did the time go? Into a life well lived, Yates replied, taking her hand. His hair was gray now and lines creased his face, but his eyes still held that same warmth and love she had first seen decades ago. You remember the day we met? Florence asked. You riding up with your rifle, saving me from those wolves. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen, Yates said, standing there, battered and exhausted, but still fighting. I was terrified, Florence admitted. Courage is not the absence of fear, Yates said. It is acting despite the fear. You have shown me that every day of our marriage. Florence leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence. You know what I think about sometimes? That if those robbers had not stopped the stagecoach, if I had made it safely to Santa Fe, I might have sold this land and gone back to Boston. I might never have known you, never had this life. But you did not go back, Yates said. You stayed. You chose this life, chose me, chose to build something real and lasting. Best decision I ever made, Florence said softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of their family inside the house. The distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods by the river. This land that had seemed so foreign and frightening when Florence first arrived had become home in the truest sense of the word. Florence, Yates said eventually, I want you to know something. What is it? When Sarah died, when I lost her, I thought my life was over. I thought I would never feel anything but grief and emptiness. I came out here to this territory because I could not stand to stay where we had been happy together. I was not living, just existing, just going through the motions day after day. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. And then I found you, or you found me, and everything changed. You reminded me what it meant to be alive, to feel joy and hope and love. You did not replace Sarah. You gave me a new chapter, a new life that was just as precious and real as the one I lost. You rescued me from a half-life, Florence. You made me whole again. Florence felt tears sliding down her cheeks. And you rescued me from a life that was never truly mine. You gave me freedom and purpose and love beyond measure. We rescued each other, Yates. He wiped away her tears with his thumbs, then kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. We did indeed. They were interrupted by Jeremiah stepping out onto the porch. Sorry to intrude, he said with a smile, but the grandchildren insist on saying good night to you both before they go to sleep. Florence and Yates exchanged a look of shared amusement and love, then stood hand in hand and went inside to their family. The years that followed were gentle ones. Florence and Yates gradually handed over more responsibility to Jeremiah and his wife, allowing themselves time to simply enjoy their life together. They took long rides across their land, remembering all the moments they had shared there. They visited Sarah and her family in Santa Fe, delighting in watching their grandchildren grow. Florence started writing, something she had always wanted to do but never had time for. She wrote about her life in the West, about the challenges and joys of building a ranch, about the landscape and people she had come to love. Her writing was eventually published in an Eastern magazine, bringing her a small measure of fame that she found amusing more than anything else. Yates spent his time with the horses, breeding and training them with the patience and skill he had developed over decades. He was sought after as a consultant by other ranchers, and he enjoyed passing on his knowledge to the next generation. They remained deeply in love, that bond that had formed when he pulled her up onto his horse all those years ago only growing stronger with time. They still held hands when they walked, still stole kisses when they thought no one was looking, still talked for hours about everything and nothing. When Florence was 65, she fell ill with pneumonia. It was a frightening time, and Yates barely left her side, bringing her medicine and water, reading to her, holding her hand through the long nights. But Florence was strong, had always been strong, and she fought her way back to health with characteristic determination. "You are not leaving me yet," Yates told her firmly as she recovered. "We have more years ahead of us." And they did. 5 more years of sunrise rides and family gatherings, of quiet evenings on the porch and busy days helping with the grandchildren. 5 more years of the life they had built together, each day a gift. It was Yates who went first in the end. He died peacefully in his sleep at 73, his hand in Florence's. She woke to find him gone, and though her heart shattered, she also felt grateful. Grateful for every moment they had shared, grateful that he had gone without pain, grateful for the full and beautiful life they had lived together. She buried him on a hill overlooking both ranches, the land they had loved and worked together. At the funeral, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Florence stood dry-eyed and spoke of the man Yates had been. Honest, kind, hard-working, loving. She spoke of how he had saved her life and how she had tried every day to be worthy of that gift. After the funeral, Jeremiah tried to convince her to move in with him and his family, but Florence refused. "This is my home," she said firmly. "This is where I belong." She lived alone in the ranch house for 3 more years, still active and sharp-minded despite her age. She rode her horse almost every day, weather permitting, and she visited Yates's grave regularly, talking to him as if he were still there. "The grandchildren are doing well," she would tell him. "Sarah's youngest just got engaged. Jeremiah expanded the north pasture like you always wanted. The ranch is thriving, Yates. Everything we built is still here, still strong." On a crisp autumn morning, much like the one when she had told Yates she was pregnant with their first child, Florence rode up to his grave one last time. She was 77 years old, and she felt tired in a way she had never felt before. "I think it is almost time," she told the headstone. "I am ready, Yates, ready to see you again." She rode back to the house slowly, taking in every detail of the land she loved. The cottonwoods by the river were turning gold. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the pastures. The house stood solid and welcoming, just as it had for all these years. That night, Florence went to bed in the room she had shared with Yates for so many years. She looked at the empty space beside her where he had slept and smiled. "Soon," she whispered. She died peacefully in her sleep, just as Yates had, and when Jeremiah found her the next morning, there was a smile on her face. They buried her next to Yates on the hill, and at her funeral, 4 generations of family gathered to honor the woman who had left Boston society to build a life in the wild New Mexico territory. Jeremiah spoke of his mother's courage and strength, of how she had turned an abandoned ranch into a thriving enterprise, of how she had loved completely and without reservation. Sarah spoke of her mother's kindness and wisdom, of the lessons she had taught not just through words but through the example of her life. She spoke of a love story that had begun with a cowboy rescuing a woman from wolves and had ended only when death finally parted them. Years later, the Riverside Ranch was still in the Xavier family, passed down through generations. The story of Florence and Yates became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren. The house still stood, maintained with care, and on the porch hung a plaque that Jeremiah had commissioned. It read, "Florence and Yates Xavier built this home and this life with love, hard work, and faith in each other. May all who enter here know the same blessings." Their graves on the hill became a place of pilgrimage for the family, a place to remember and honor the 2 people who had started it all. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right across the prairie, some claimed they could still hear echoes of laughter from the porch, still see 2 figures riding together across the land they had loved. The ranch prospered for generations, a testament to what Florence and Yates had built together. The original house was preserved as a family heritage site, while newer structures were built to accommodate the growing operation. But the heart of the ranch, the spirit of it, remained rooted in the love story that had begun when a desperate woman ran from wolves and a lonely cowboy saved her. In the town of Santa Fe, a historical marker was eventually erected, telling the story of Florence Ramsey Xavier, the Boston woman who had become one of the territory's most successful ranchers. It mentioned her innovations in irrigation and horse breeding, her advocacy for education and infrastructure, her successful writing career. But it also mentioned the love story at the heart of it all, how she and Yates Xavier had built not just a ranch but a legacy of partnership and devotion. The story of their life together became more than just family legend. It became part of the larger story of the West, of the people who had built lives in harsh and beautiful country, who had faced challenges with courage and had loved with their whole hearts. It was a story of second chances and new beginnings, of finding home in unexpected places, of love that transformed and endured. Florence had come to New Mexico running from wolves, carrying nothing but fear and desperation. Yates had been living a shadow life, going through motions without meaning or joy. Together, They had found everything they needed. She had given him a reason to live fully again. He had given her the freedom to become who she was meant to be. Their descendants never forgot that lesson. Love was not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It was about two people choosing each other every day, building a life together through hard work and dedication, finding joy in simple moments and strength in shared purpose. The land they had loved continued to flourish. The river still ran clear and cold from the mountains, and the cottonwoods still turned gold every autumn. The house still stood strong, and the barn that Yates had helped rebuild in those early days still sheltered horses and cattle. Everything they had touched, everything they had built, remained. But more than the physical legacy, Florence and Yates left behind something far more valuable. They left the example of a love that had transformed both their lives, that had taken two broken, lonely people and made them whole. They left the proof that it was never too late to start over, never too late to find joy, never too late to love with abandon. The cowboy who had rescued a woman from wolves had found his own rescue in her love, in her fierce determination to build a life worth living. The Boston woman who had felt trapped and purposeless had found freedom and meaning in the wild New Mexico landscape and in the arms of a man who valued her for exactly who she was. Together, they had written a love story for the ages, one that began with survival and grew into something beautiful and lasting. And though they were long gone, their love remained, woven into the very fabric of the land, living on in every generation that followed, a reminder that the greatest adventures often begin with a single moment of courage, and that true love has the power to rescue us all from lives half-lived.